I was 58 when I learned the cruelest truth about love. Men don't always walk away because they stop caring. Sometimes we walk away because staying would expose how broken we are. And that night, standing in a quiet house that suddenly felt too big, I chose silence over everything that mattered. I could still see her there, Evelyn Carter, one hand on the door, the other wrapped around the handle of a suitcase she never wanted to pack. The porch light casting a soft gold line across the floor between us like a boundary neither of us knew how to cross. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just looked at me the way you look at someone you've already lost and asked one simple question. Are you going to fight for this, or are you going to let me go? And I remember thinking I had 100 answers, 1,000 reasons, but none of them made it past my throat because somewhere along the way I had learned that real men don't beg. Real men don't break. Real men don't admit they're afraid of losing the one thing they can't replace. So I stood there, hands at my sides, heart pounding like it was trying to speak for me, and I said nothing, not a word, not even her name. And that silence, that single moment of pride dressed up as strength, was louder than anything I could have said. She nodded once, like she understood something I didn't, stepped out into the cool night air, and closed the door behind her with a quiet click that echoed through every year that came after. And that was the night I didn't lose love. That was the night I walked away from it and told myself I'd never look back. The house did not feel empty right away. That would have been too honest, too easy to understand. Instead, it felt normal in the most unsettling way, like nothing important had just happened. Her coffee mug still sat on the counter with a faint ring dried into the ceramic. Her jacket still hung on the back of the chair like she had just stepped out for fresh air. And for a moment, I let myself believe she would come back through that door and ask me the same question again. Give me one more chance to answer it. Right, but minutes turned into hours, and the silence settled into something heavier, something permanent. I walked through each room slowly, noticing details I had ignored for years. The way she folded the blankets too neatly, the way she left small notes I never read, the way her presence had filled spaces I never realized were empty before she came into my life. And that was the part no one tells you about walking away. It does not feel like strength. It feels like standing in a life that still looks the same, but no longer belongs to you. I told myself I had done the right thing, that keeping my pride intact mattered more than saying words I did not know how to say. I poured a glass of water and let it sit untouched. I turned on the television and muted it within seconds. Every distraction felt artificial, like trying to cover a crack in glass that kept spreading no matter how carefully you handled it. And sometime after midnight, I picked up my phone, stared at her name, and realized that walking away is not a single decision. It is a series of moments where you choose not to go back. And that night, I made the second choice. I did not call her, and that silence began to define the man I would become. I told myself the next morning would feel different. That daylight would soften what the night had made heavy. But the sun only revealed things more clearly. It filled the house with a quiet brightness that made every absence sharper. Her side of the closet half empty. The space on the bathroom counter where her things used to be, the faint outline of where her picture had sat on the shelf like a ghost that refused to leave. I went through the motions of a normal day. Made coffee, I did not. Drink, checked emails I did not read. Sat in a chair that suddenly felt too still, and somewhere between those small, ordinary actions, I began building the version of myself that people would later call strong. The man who keeps going, the man who does not dwell, the man who knows when to walk away. But the truth was quieter and harder to admit. I was not moving forward. I was avoiding looking back because looking back meant replaying that moment at the door, hearing her voice again, feeling the weight of what I chose not to say. And that kind of memory does not just sit with you. It asks questions you're not ready to answer. Days turn into weeks, and I got better at it, better at filling time, better at speaking about everything except the one thing that mattered. Friends would ask how I was doing, and I would say I was fine. And eventually, even I started to believe it. That is how it works. Not with one big lie, but with small ones repeated until they sound like truth. And somewhere along the way, I stopped reaching for my phone at night. Stopped expecting her name to light up the screen. Not because I had healed, but because I had trained myself to live without expecting anything at all. And that is when it becomes real. Not when they leave, but when you finally learn how to exist as if they never will come back. At some point, people started calling me disciplined. They said I had my life together, that I was the kind of man who knew what he wanted and did not let emotions get in the way. And I let them believe it because it was easier than explaining the truth that discipline can sometimes be nothing more than carefully structured avoidance. I filled my days with routines that left no room for reflection: early mornings, long drives with no destination, evenings spent in quiet spaces where no one asked personal questions, and over time, that version of me became convincing. Even to myself, I stopped noticing how often my thoughts circled back to her, how certain songs made me change the station without thinking, how I avoided the street where we used to walk because it felt like stepping into a memory that had not finished happening yet. And that is the part most people misunderstand about men like me. We do not forget. We reorganize. We take something that once mattered more than anything and move it somewhere we do not have to see it every day. But it is still there, unchanged, waiting. I told myself that she had moved on, that she was happier without me, that reaching out would only reopen something better left closed. And maybe part of that was true, but another part was fear, not fear of rejection, but fear of confirmation, fear that she had indeed built a life where I no longer existed. And so I stayed where I was, in a version of stability that required no risk, no vulnerability, no chance of hearing the words I had avoided that night. And the longer I stayed there, the easier it became to believe that walking away had been the right choice, even though somewhere deep down, I knew it had never been about choosing what was right. It had always been about choosing what felt safer in the moment. It happened on a Tuesday that felt like any other, the kind of day you do not expect to remember. I had stopped at a small bookstore off a side street I had never noticed before, not because I needed anything, but because I had learned to fill empty hours with quiet places. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as I stepped inside, and there was something about the smell of old paper and coffee that made time slow down, just enough for thoughts to catch up with you. I walked past shelves, without really looking, until something stopped me. A familiar cover, a book I had once given her years ago, the same edition, same worn edges, and for a moment I just stood there staring like it meant more than it should. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and that was when I saw it, a small note written inside the front page in handwriting I knew instantly, neat, steady, unmistakably hers. Some stories do not end. They just wait until we are ready to read them again. My chest tightened in a way I had not felt in years. Not sharp, not overwhelming, just deep, like something long buried had shifted. I looked around the store without thinking, as if she might be there, as if this was not coincidence, but something else, something I'd spent years convincing myself did not exist. And in that moment, I realized something I had avoided for a long time. Walking away had never erased anything. It had only delayed it, and maybe, just maybe, not looking back had never meant the story was over. It only meant I had not been ready to see what was still there. I did not buy the book right away. I just stood there holding it like it was something fragile, something that could disappear if I moved too quickly, the note replaying in my mind over and over, each word landing differently than it would have years ago, because back then I would have dismissed it as sentiment, as something soft, something easy to ignore, but now it felt like a message that had been waiting for me to catch up to it. I walked to the counter eventually, placed the book down, and asked the woman behind it how long it had been there. She glanced at it, then at me, and said it had come in a few months ago with a small collection someone had dropped off. No name, no story, just books looking for new owners. I nodded like that answer made sense, like everything about this was ordinary, but it did not feel ordinary. It felt precise, like time had arranged something I'd spent years avoiding. I took the book with me when I left, sat in my car with it resting on the passenger seat, and for a long time I did nothing. No engine, no radio, just silence, and that quiet pull I had learned to ignore. I told myself it did not mean anything, that it was just coincidence, but the truth was harder to push away now, because for the first time in years I was not just remembering her, I was feeling the absence of what I never allowed myself to fight for. And that feeling did not ask politely, it stayed, it waited, and it made one thing clear: I had spent all this time convincing myself I had moved on, when in reality I had only been standing still, refusing to turn around and face what I left behind. I drove back to that bookstore the next day, without planning to, like my body had already made the decision before my mind could argue against it. The same quiet bell greeted me. The same soft light filled the room. But this time I was not just passing through. I was looking not for a book, but for something I could not quite name yet. I walked the aisle slower, paying attention to details I would have ignored before. The way the owner arranged certain titles near the front, the small table. By the window with two chairs that looked like they had held long conversations. And then I saw it. Not her, not at first, but something that made my chest tighten the same way the note had. A familiar scarf draped over the back of one of those chairs, simple, light gray, the kind she used to wear on cool mornings. I told myself it could belong to anyone, that I was reading meaning into ordinary things again, but then I heard her voice, soft, steady, unmistakable, speaking from the other side of the shelf, and for a second, everything in me stopped, not panic, not fear, just a stillness, so complete it felt like time had paused. I did not move right away. I just stood there listening, the sound of her laughter quieter than I remembered, but still the same. And in that moment, I understood something I'd spent years avoiding. It was not that I did not know how to go back. It was that I had never allowed myself to try. And now, standing just a few feet away from the woman I once let walk out of my life, I realized that walking away had been easy, but turning around, that was the part one had never learned how to do. I stepped forward before I could change my mind, the floor creaking softly beneath my weight, and that small sound was enough. Her voice stopped, the quiet that followed heavier than anything that came before. And when she turned, it was not dramatic, not sudden, just a simple movement that carried years of distance in it. Evelyn Carter stood there looking at me the same way she had that night, except this time there was no question in her eyes, only recognition, steady and unguarded. And for a moment neither of us spoke, not because we did not have words, but because we both knew that whatever came next would matter in a way silence never could. I noticed the details I used to overlook, the way she held herself with a quiet strength, the calm in her expression that came from living without waiting for someone else to change. And it hit me all at once. She had not been frozen in time like I had. She had moved forward, grown into someone who no longer needed the version of me that had. "Let her go high, Daniel," she said, her voice even, familiar, and impossibly distant all at once. And I felt something in my chest tighten, not regret exactly, but the weight of understanding, because standing there, I finally saw the truth I'd spent years avoiding, that walking away had not just been a decision, it had been a message, one she had heard clearly, one that had taught her how to live without me. And now, facing her again, I realized this was not about getting her back, it was about whether I could finally become the man who would not stay silent when it mattered most. I held her gaze for a second longer than I would have in the past, long enough to feel the weight of every year I had spent avoiding this exact moment. And when I finally spoke, my voice was not steady, not practiced, just honest in a way I had never allowed before. I should have said something that night. The words came out slower than I expected, like they had been waiting behind a locked door. Evelyn did not interrupt, did not look away. She just listened, and that alone felt different from anything we had before. I thought staying quiet made me strong. I continued, feeling the truth settle as I said it out loud. But all it did was make me lose you. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden shift, just a quiet understanding in her expression that told me she had already lived through this realization without me. I waited a long time to hear that, she said softly, not accusing, not forgiving, just stating something that had already passed, and I nodded because that was. The part one could not change. Time does not give you credit for lessons learned too late, but it does give you a choice about what you do next. I took a breath, not to prepare a perfect answer, but to stay present in a moment I would have once avoided. I did not know what happens from here, I admitted, but I know I did not want to walk away again without trying, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to protect myself from what her response might be, because something had already shifted, not around me, but within me, and as we stood there in the quiet of that small bookstore, I understood something simple and lasting. Some men do not stop believing in love. We just spend years learning how to stand still long enough to finally choose it.